The envelope arrived like a harbinger of war, crisp and white, with the unmistakable letterhead of the Evergreen Meadows Homeowners Association. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the contents, her eyes scanning the meticulously typed pages that would change everything. She had known this moment might come, but the reality hit her like a punch to the gut. The garden beds that had been her pride and joy, carefully cultivated over 3 summers, filled with heirloom tomatoes, vibrant peppers, and a kaleidoscope of herbs, were now the subject of official scrutiny. The neighborhood of Maple Ridge had always been pristine, almost sterile in its uniformity. Identical beige houses lined up like soldiers, each lawn a perfect carpet of emerald green, meticulously trimmed and chemically maintained. Sarah's garden was different. It was alive, wild, a rebellion against the neighborhood's suffocating aesthetic. Her quarter-acre lot had been transformed into a sustainable paradise. Raised beds created from reclaimed wood stood in geometric precision, each filled with rich, dark soil that held the promise of abundance. Pollinator-friendly flowers danced between vegetable plots, and a small greenhouse caught the morning light like a crystal cathedral. To Sarah, it was more than just a garden. It was a statement, a way of life. But the HOA saw it differently. Violation of community aesthetic guidelines, a letter proclaimed in bold, underlined text. Specific infractions were itemized with bureaucratic precision. Raised beds exceeding approved height, non-uniform plantings, visible gardening structures not conforming to community standards. The final paragraph was a thinly veiled threat: remove the garden beds within 30 days or face potential fines and legal action. Sarah remembered the day she first broke ground on this garden. It had been 3 years after her divorce, a period when she needed something to nurture, something that was entirely her own. Each seed planted was an act of personal restoration. The garden had become her sanctuary, her therapy, her quiet rebellion against a life that had once felt predetermined and restrictive. Her neighbors had watched with a mixture of confusion and mild disapproval. John Williams next door would passive-aggressively comment about property values during their occasional encounters. Martha Richardson, who lived across the street, would purse her lips whenever Sarah's wildflowers would send their seeds dancing across the perfectly manicured street. But Sarah had persevered. She'd researched sustainable gardening, attended workshops, connected with local agricultural experts. Her garden wasn't just beautiful, it was a model of ecological responsibility. Rainwater collection systems, companion planting techniques, and organic pest management made her little plot a mini ecosystem. Now that dream was under attack. The HOA's letter wasn't just about garden beds. It was about control, about maintaining a suffocating status quo that valued uniformity over individual expression. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her beloved garden, Sarah made a decision. This wasn't going to be the end of her story. This was going to be the beginning of something much bigger. Little did she know how prophetic that thought would become. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed with an intensity that matched the electric tension in the room. Sarah sat near the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, surrounded by the familiar faces of her neighbors who now felt more like adversaries. Robert Hartley, the HOA president, stood at the podium, a tall, silver-haired man whose pressed khakis and navy blazer seemed to embody the neighborhood's rigid expectations. His voice dripped with condescension as he outlined the community standards that Sarah's garden had supposedly violated. "We are not simply talking about a few plants," Hartley proclaimed, his pointer finger jabbing the air for emphasis. "We are discussing the preservation of property values, community aesthetics, and the very fabric of our neighborhood's identity." Sarah knew the subtext. Her garden was too wild, too unconventional. It challenged the manicured perfection that had defined Maple Ridge for decades. What they saw as chaos, she saw as life, vibrant, interconnected, resilient. When the floor opened for comments, the first to speak was John Williams, her next-door neighbor. "I've watched this garden grow," he began, shooting Sarah a look that was part disapproval, part something else, something she couldn't quite read. "And I can tell you it's nothing but a breeding ground for pests and problems." Martha Richardson chimed in next, her voice a shrill punctuation to John's statement. "My husband's allergies have been terrible since those wild plants started spreading. It's a health hazard." Sarah waited, her heart racing. She had prepared for this moment. From her messenger bag, she pulled out a meticulously prepared folder: scientific studies, local environmental impact reports, documentation of the garden's biodiversity. When she finally stood, the room fell silent. "This garden isn't just my personal space," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "It's a working ecosystem. Those weeds Martha complains about are actually native plants that support local pollinators. The biodiversity here has increased by 67% since I started this project." She began distributing copies of her research: studies from local agricultural extensions, reports from environmental scientists, data about urban gardening's positive impacts. Each page was a carefully constructed argument for her garden's existence. Robert Hartley's expression shifted. What had started as smug certainty was now tinged with uncertainty. A younger woman, Alina Rodriguez, who Sarah knew worked as an environmental lawyer, raised her hand. "These documents are quite compelling," she said, leafing through the papers. "Has the HOA conducted any independent environmental assessment?" The room erupted into murmurs. Hartley's confident demeanor began to crack. Sarah realized in that moment that this was about more than her garden. It was about challenging a system that valued uniformity over sustainability, conformity over creativity. Her little plot of land had become a battleground for something much larger. As the meeting continued, Sarah noticed something unexpected. A few neighbors, initially silent, were now looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Something was shifting, though she couldn't yet understand exactly what. The fight for her garden had only just begun. The fallout from the community meeting spread through Maple Ridge like wildfire. Sarah had become something of a local sensation, a reluctant activist who had dared to challenge the HOA's long-standing iron grip on neighborhood aesthetics. Alina Rodriguez, the environmental lawyer who had spoken up during the meeting, reached out to Sarah the following week. They met at a local coffee shop, a small, independent place that felt worlds away from the sterile uniformity of Maple Ridge. "Your garden is more than just a personal project," Alina explained, spreading out additional research on their shared table. "It's become a potential landmark case for urban sustainability and homeowner rights." The lawyer revealed that several environmental organizations had taken an interest in Sarah's situation. They saw her garden as a test case, a potential precedent for challenging restrictive HOA regulations that stifled ecological innovation. But not everyone was supportive. The HOA doubled down, sending Sarah a formal notice of violation with increased potential fines. John Williams, her next-door neighbor, seemed to be working behind the scenes, rallying support for the HOA's position. What Sarah didn't know was that John had his own complicated relationship with the garden. Years ago, before his retirement, he had been an agricultural researcher. His public criticism masked a deeper, more nuanced perspective that was yet to be revealed. The local media caught wind of the story. A local news station sent a reporter to interview Sarah, transforming her personal battle into a community conversation about sustainability, individual rights, and the changing nature of suburban landscapes. Social media became an unexpected battleground. Photos of Sarah's garden went viral, with gardening enthusiasts and environmental activists sharing her story far beyond Maple Ridge. Hashtags like #SaveSarahsGarden and #HOWavesNature began trending locally. But viral support didn't translate to immediate victory. The HOA scheduled a formal hearing, promising to carefully review Sarah's documentation and research. Elena advised caution, explaining that these proceedings could go either way. During this time, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. More people stopped to look at her garden. Children pressed their faces against fences, fascinated by the riot of colors and buzzing pollinators. Some neighbors began tentatively experimenting with their own small garden patches. One unexpected development came from an older resident, Margaret Thompson. A longtime Maple Ridge resident in her 80s, Margaret had watched the entire controversy unfold. She approached Sarah one afternoon as she was working in her garden. "In all my years," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly strong, "I've never seen something so alive in this neighborhood." She revealed a secret. Margaret's late husband had been an agricultural scientist who had always criticized the sterile, chemical-dependent approach to suburban landscaping. Her support for Sarah was more than just sympathy. It was a tribute to her husband's lifelong passion. As the formal hearing approached, Sarah realized the garden had become something much larger than her personal sanctuary. It was now a symbol of resistance, a possibility of reimagining what community could mean. The battle was far from over. But for the first time, Sarah felt she wasn't fighting alone. The day of the formal HOA hearing arrived with an unseasonable heat that seemed to mirror the tension brewing in Maple Ridge. Sarah arrived at the community center accompanied by Alina Rodriguez, her documentation carefully organized in a leather portfolio. The hearing room was packed. What had once been a private dispute had transformed into a community spectacle. Local environmental activists, curious neighbors, and even a few journalists filled the seats. Margaret Thompson sat in the front row, her presence a quiet statement of solidarity. Robert Hartley, the HOA president, looked noticeably uncomfortable. The viral attention and media coverage had put unexpected pressure on the organization. What should have been a routine enforcement action had become a public relations nightmare. Alina's strategy was calculated. She didn't just defend the garden, she reframed the entire conversation. Expert witnesses had been lined up, including a local botanist and an urban ecology professor from the state university. Their testimony would challenge the HOA's narrow definition of community aesthetics. The first bombshell came from an unexpected source. John Williams, Sarah's previously antagonistic neighbor, requested to speak. The room held its breath as he approached the microphone. I've been in agricultural research for over 40 years, John began, his voice carrying the weight of professional expertise. And I can say without reservation that what Sarah has created is not a nuisance. It's a model of sustainable urban agriculture. His statement was a complete reversal of his earlier public stance. Later, Sarah would learn that John had been conducting his own quiet investigation, validating her garden's environmental impact. The botanist presented compelling evidence. Sarah's garden supported 23 different pollinator species, including 3 endangered native bee populations. Her native plant selections had created a micro-ecosystem that was actually improving local biodiversity. But the most shocking moment was yet to come. An internal investigation revealed that the HOA had been receiving undisclosed payments from a local landscaping company that benefited from the strict, uniform landscape requirements. Alina Rodriguez methodically presented evidence of potential conflicts of interest that implicated several HOA board members. Robert Hartley's face turned to action. What had begun as a simple enforcement action was now a potential legal and ethical scandal. The hearing room buzzed with whispers. Sarah sat quietly, hardly believing the turn of events. Her garden, once a personal sanctuary, then a point of contention, had become something much larger. It was now evidence of systemic problems within the community's governance. As the hearing continued, it became clear that the outcome would be about much more than a single garden. It was about the future of community spaces, environmental responsibility, and individual rights. Margaret Thompson caught Sarah's eye and gave a knowing smile. Something fundamental was changing in Maple Ridge, and Sarah's garden was at the center of that transformation. The final decision was yet to be made, but the balance of power had already shifted. The HOA board had been completely restructured. Robert Hartley and 2 other board members resigned following the investigation into their landscaping company kickback scheme. Alina Rodriguez, with Sarah's support, helped draft new community guidelines that encouraged sustainable landscaping and native plant conservation. Sarah's garden had become more than just a personal project. It was now a neighborhood landmark. The local university had begun using it as a research site for urban ecology studies. School groups regularly visited, learning about biodiversity, sustainable agriculture, and community resilience. John Williams, it turned out, had been harboring a secret passion for sustainable gardening for years. He approached Sarah with a proposal to create a community education program focused on ecological landscaping. Together, they began offering workshops, teaching neighbors how to transform their own sterile lawns into vibrant living ecosystems. Margaret Thompson played an unexpected role in the neighborhood's transformation. She donated a portion of her substantial retirement fund to create a community grant program that would support sustainable landscaping projects. The first grant went to a group of local teenagers who wanted to create a community garden at the local middle school. The media attention had broader implications. Neighboring communities began reaching out, asking about Maple Ridge's innovative approach to urban landscaping. What had started as a conflict over a single garden had become a model for community-driven environmental change. Sarah reflected on the journey as she worked in her garden one crisp autumn morning. The raised beds that had once been a point of contention were now celebrated. Pollinators danced among the late-season flowers, and the soil, rich and alive, told a story of resilience and transformation. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Alina Rodriguez. The state legislature was considering new guidelines for HOA regulations, inspired in part by the Maple Ridge case. Would Sarah be willing to testify? She looked out over the garden, remembering the day she'd received that first threatening letter. So much had changed. What seemed like a personal battle had become a community movement, a testament to the power of persistence, science, and vision. The garden had always been more than just plants and soil. It was a living, breathing argument for what was possible when people were willing to challenge the status quo. As the first leaves of autumn began to fall, Sarah smiled. This was just the beginning.